Hi everybody, this is Lee, and I'm talking about Ida B. Wells with this video. I claimed in earlier videos that whenever someone threw up Hillary Clinton in my face or in the face of other women in regards to the women's protests and the movements and things like this, that I would throw back Shirley Chisholm and say, get to know her. Hillary Clinton is not the only woman who ran for president or was deeply involved in politics. That Shirley Chisholm was a great contributor to modern politics in terms of women of color, women in general, certainly African American. And then I said, you know what? I probably need to go back further to Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells has a very impressive background. She did not hold public office or governmental office, but she greatly contributed to public affairs and public policy. She was a crusader, very tireless, very instrumental in her writings and her research and her travels and her history. And so I'll let people know about Ida B. Wells, and I'll post a link in the description so people can see for themselves why she is so impressive and why her, along with folks like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, serve as role models for women. Okay, so this is actually an article that I found at Counterpunch. And it's Ida B. Wells-Barnett, Iola, Princess of the Press, and Feminist Crusader for Equality and Justice. And so you know by that title, you're going to hear some social justice warrior kind of stuff. And hey, that's what's going on here. She was pretty tireless in her endeavors to promote equality and justice along gender lines and racial lines too. This is written by Kilu Nyasha. And so she was born in Mississippi in 1862. And she was born to parents who had been slaves 6 months before chattel slavery was ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. She eventually got educated, and she moved to Memphis, Tennessee. She taught school and continued her education by attending Fisk University and Lemoyne Institute. And so she was a writer, and her career started in 1884 when she was forced into the smoking car of a train, even though she paid for first class non-smoking privileges. The conductor ordered her to the back of the train, and this was like half a century before Rosa Parks. And so, you know, we can say before Rosa Parks, there was Ida B. Wells. And so she was forced into the back of the train. And when she got back to Memphis, she brought suit against the railroad company. And the court ruled in her favor and awarded her $500 in damage. And they said that the railroad company violated the separate but equal laws by forcing Wells to ride in a smoking car. But that was separate but not first class, which is what she paid for. And then 3 years later, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the decision. But it was the first case of its kind in the South, and so people were very interested in its outcome. But anyway, Ida B. Wells wrote about that. It was her first article. It was for the Living Way. It's a Black Memphis newspaper. And she had her pen name, which was Iola. And so she kept writing for the Living Way, the Evening Star, and Free Speech. And she actually became part owner of the Free Speech. And so that was a tremendous gift that Ida B. Wells had, a strong character, a willingness to stand up for what was right, and then being a very prolific writer, which means that she left many documents and writings on that time of her life. And so she exposed the inferior facilities of black schools in Memphis. And then she was fired from her teaching job. But that left her free to continue to fight full time for justice and equality. And she continued to write, and her articles appeared in journals and newspapers around the nation. Okay, and so she also wrote her autobiography, and a significant passage is when 3 of her friends were lynched. And they were owners of a grocery store. And this presence of this grocery store angered the white men who considered the owners of the grocery store uppity. And so they sought to eliminate the competition that black-owned grocery store represented. And so they actually launched an armed attack on the grocery store, which was terrorism, domestic terrorism. The owners of the grocery store fought back, and then all 3 were arrested, and then a mob came for them. So they were defending their store, which was attacked by 3 white men who were jealous. And then they were arrested, and then a mob came and took them from the jail and lynched them and murdered them. And so Ida B. Wells, she wrote an editorial in the Free Speech newspaper, and she said that lynching was an excuse to get rid of Negroes, as she called them, who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keep the race terrorized. And she says to keep what she calls the N-word down. And so she also says in an editorial that she recommended that people who were of African American descent who face these trials, that they leave the city, that they make an exodus. And many people took her advice and they left Memphis for Oklahoma because that's how bad the culture was in terms of black people trying to build wealth and prosperity for themselves. And then when that editorial that Ida B. Wells wrote was published, a mob invaded her offices and destroyed all of her printing equipment and the newspapers that they could find. And so her life was actually in danger. She moved to Chicago, and she continued her attacks on the racist criminality and Southern injustice. And so the New York Age, another newspaper, began to print her articles after her newspaper was destroyed. And Ida B. Wells launched lecturing tour to the Northeast. And she was spreading a message about not slavery, but about lynching, which was domestic terrorism that involved the torture and murder of African American men, women, and children. So she spoke at a conference of Black women's clubs, and she investigated lynchings. By 1893, over 1,000 Black men, women, and children had been hanged, shot, and burned to death by white mobs in America. And so she says during the late 1800s, the violence against Blacks increased at a very alarming rate, and mob rule was becoming normalized. And this was because of the Ku Klux Klan. They murdered and lynched innocent Blacks while most Southern whites just simply looked the other direction. And so Wells traveled the country. She investigated eyewitnesses to the lynchings. She visited the scenes of 728 murders. And so she found that only a third involved blacks who were actually accused of a crime. And again, not only men, but women and children were involved or were murdered. And we know from the recent discovery or revelation that Emmett Till, one of those children who was tortured and murdered, lynched by a mob, the accuser, the white woman who initiated that violence against him, actually revealed that she had falsified her testimony in regards to Emmett Till. And so, if anyone's seen the picture of him in his casket, horrific things, unimaginable things were done to that child based on false testimony. And this is only one example. Okay, and so Wells also wrote that in many of the so-called rape cases, there was evidence of consensual relationships. And that was published in one of her pamphlets, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All of Its Phases. And so she spearheaded the development of numerous African women's organizations in Chicago and Boston. She was a tireless worker for the women's right to vote. She was friends with both Susan B. Anthony and Jane Addams. Susan B. Anthony was a suffragist, and Jane Addams was an activist involved with poverty and class issues. And so Ida B. Wells was also involved with both. And then she was a representative to a press convention, the first female. And then at 1889, at a Washington, D.C. convention, she was elected secretary to the National Press Association. And that's where she met Frederick Douglass. So she's already breathing rare air between Susan B. Anthony and Jane Addams and Frederick Douglass, but that's not all. She collaborated with Douglass on writing a pamphlet, Reasons Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition. And this was because black people were excluded from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. She was also an activist to block the establishment of segregated schools. This was years before Thurgood Marshall. Ida B. Wells was already on it. And she established the first kindergarten in a black neighborhood. She did a lecture tour of England, Scotland, and Wales, inspiring those international organizations to apply pressure on America to end segregation and lynching. And so she did write a report, and it's called A Red Record, Tabulated Statistics and Alleged Causes of Lynching in the United States. And she argued that the impetus behind lynching was economic. And so, again, people claim, we can't really focus on identity politics. We need to focus on economics. But we can see that in many cases, there is intersection between the two. And so for those who live within an identity that is a target, they have no other choice but to focus on those type of politics as they intersect with economics. And so, okay, she got married to a newspaper man, not surprisingly. And then she also joined with W.E.B. Du Bois and others to further the Niagara movement, which eventually became the NAACP. So she was instrumental with the founding, although she was excluded from the leadership circle. She also founded the National Association of Colored Women. She formed the Negro Fellowship League, and she established the first Black Women's Suffrage Club. And she marched in a suffrage parade and met with, in Washington, D.C., and met with William McKinley about a certain lynching in South Carolina. So again, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, President William McKinley, she's in the mix. She's at ground zero. And she also became involved with Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then in the years following World War I, she covered various race riots in Arkansas, East St. Louis, and Chicago, and she published her reports on those. And so she wrote her autobiography. She was actually inspired to run for the Illinois State Senate about 60 years before Barack Obama. So that's fantastic. She did lose to the incumbent. And so she continued her community organizing, just leaving a serious history, a long-lasting history. Courage, sacrifice, activism, literacy, courage, things like this. She's very active in the struggle. One of the 20th century's most remarkable women. And so that again, that's just to say that this is a type of black girl magic, but even that doesn't fully capture Ida B. Wells' contribution to social justice warriorism, political activism, public policy, public affairs, elevating the discussion on domestic terrorism, segregation, and racism. Definitely economic terrorism used against African Americans who were trying to make improvements to their lives and their economic situation following slavery, and just documenting the efforts that were used to suppress and tear down what blacks tried to build. Ida B. Wells was there, never afraid to speak out and to write and distribute the reality as she saw it. So I recommend everyone go to this article. The link is in the description. And then if you're able, pick up her autobiography and then maybe a biography and learn about a fantastic woman who is not Hillary Clinton.